At my granddaughter's wedding, I discovered I was the unwanted guest. They would pay dearly for that mistake. What they didn't know was that this embarrassing grandmother had been hiding family secrets worth more than their mansion. By the end of that night, everyone would remember exactly who built the foundation they were standing on. The amber light of dusk filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret O'Sullivan's modest sitting room, casting dancing shadows across the worn Persian rug that had witnessed decades of family gatherings. The old wooden clock on the mantelpiece ticked rhythmically, its gentle sound mingling with the distant hum of evening traffic beyond the quiet suburban street. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, its burgundy velvet worn smooth by years of use, her weathered hands resting on a photo album that lay closed in her lap. At 78, her once auburn hair had turned silver white, pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the elegant bone structure that had made her a beauty in her youth. Her eyes, still sharp despite the network of fine lines that surrounded them, held depth. Ireland, 1962. The camera of memory pans across rolling green hills dotted with stone walls and grazing sheep. A young Margaret, barely 18, runs barefoot through a meadow, her auburn hair streaming behind her like a banner. She's laughing, pure and joyous, as she races toward a figure waiting by an ancient oak tree. Thomas O'Sullivan, 21, with dark hair and eyes that sparkle with mischief and love. "I was so young then," Margaret murmured, her thumb caressing the photograph. "Younger than your mother is now. I thought I knew everything about life, about love, how foolish we are in our youth." The scene shifts to a small stone church, filled with wildflowers and the warm glow of candles. Margaret, in a simple white dress that had belonged to her mother, exchanges vows with Thomas. Their families crowd around them afterward, his parents beaming with pride, her own mother wiping away tears of joy while her father shakes Thomas's hand with the firm grip of approval. "Your grandfather, Thomas," Margaret continued, her voice growing softer, "was the kindest man I ever knew. He had these hands," she held up her own, "that could fix anything broken, anything except what was breaking inside his own body." Emma leaned closer, studying the photograph. "He looks so happy. You both do." "We were happy, darling. For a while, we were the happiest people in all of County Cork. We came to America just 2 months after our wedding, full of dreams and determination. Thomas had a job lined up at the shipyard in Boston, and well, I was going to be the perfect wife, and someday the perfect mother." She turned the page, revealing photographs of their first apartment in Boston, a tiny 2-room flat with a kitchenette and a view of the harbor. Margaret in the images looked so young, so eager, arranging flowers in a chipped vase, hanging curtains at the single window. "We had so little money," she remembered, "but somehow we had everything." Thomas would come home from the shipyard covered in grease and metal shavings, and I would have dinner waiting, usually something creative made from whatever we could afford. Potatoes and hope. We used to joke. The memory becomes cinematic. Thomas walking through the door of their small apartment, his face lighting up at the sight of Margaret. She runs to him, not caring about the dirt on his clothes, and he spins her around the tiny living room while she laughs. The camera captures the golden hour light streaming through their window, illuminating the shabby furniture and making it look like a palace. Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand gently. What happened next? Margaret's expression grew complicated, joy and sorrow intertwining on her weathered features. "Life happened, sweetheart. Beautiful, terrible, wonderful life." She turned several pages, revealing a progression of photographs. Margaret with a growing belly, glowing with maternal pride. Thomas painting a small bedroom yellow because they couldn't afford to find out the baby's gender. And finally, a hospital photo of Margaret holding a tiny, wrinkled infant. "Your father." Margaret said simply. Michael Thomas O'Sullivan, born on March 15th, 1963, during one of the worst snowstorms Boston had seen in a decade. Thomas had to shovel his way to the hospital, but he made it just in time. The flashback shows Thomas bursting into the hospital room, snow still on his coat, his face flushed with cold and excitement. He approaches the bed where Margaret lies, exhausted but radiant, cradling their son. When he sees the baby for the first time, this tough shipyard worker begins to cry, tears of pure joy streaming down his face. He cried harder than the baby did, Margaret laughed, the memory warming her voice. Said he'd never seen anything so perfect in all his life. For the next 2 years, Michael was the center of our universe. Thomas would work 10-hour days, then come home and spend hours just watching our son sleep, as if he couldn't quite believe this miracle belonged to us. Emma smiled, trying to imagine her serious, businessman father as a gurgling infant. Did he have hair? Barely a wisp, Margaret chuckled. He was bald as an egg until he was almost 2. Thomas used to say he looked like a little monk. Her expression grew tender. Your father doesn't remember this, of course, but Thomas would sing to him every night. Old Irish lullabies his own father had sung to him. Michael would fall asleep in his arms. So peaceful, so trusting. The photographs continued. Michael's first steps, his second birthday party in their still tiny apartment, Thomas teaching him to throw a ball in a small patch of grass behind their building. Each image captured moments of simple joy, a young family making the most of what they had. Then Margaret's fingers hesitated before turning the next page. Emma, darling, what I'm about to tell you, it changed everything. Sometimes life gives us burdens we never expected to carry, and we have to find strength we didn't know we possessed. The scene darkens, becoming more muted in color. Thomas is sitting at their small kitchen table, papers spread before him, his head in his hands. Margaret stands behind him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them looking older somehow, worn down by invisible weight. Your grandfather started having headaches, Margaret said quietly. Terrible headaches that would leave him dizzy and sick. At first, we thought it was just stress from work. The shipyard was loud, dangerous work, and he was always worried about providing for us. But the headaches got worse. And then came the moments when he would just disappear. Emma frowned, not understanding. Disappear? Not physically, sweetheart. But his mind would go somewhere else. He would be standing right in front of me, but his eyes would be empty, confused. He would forget conversations we'd had minutes before, or sometimes not recognize where he was. The flashback shows Thomas in the middle of changing Michael's diaper, suddenly freezing, staring down at the baby with complete bewilderment, as if he'd never seen him before. Margaret rushes over, gently guiding Thomas's hands, whispering reassurances while her own heart breaks with fear. The doctors had a name for it, Margaret continued, her voice steady but pained. Early onset Alzheimer's disease. At 28 years old, your grandfather was losing his mind, piece by piece, day by day. She turned the page to reveal photographs that showed the progression of time and illness. Thomas looking increasingly thin and confused, Margaret's smile becoming more forced, more brittle. There were fewer pictures now, as if documenting their happiness had become too painful. I was 25 years old with a 2-year-old son and a husband who was slowly disappearing before my eyes, Margaret said. The doctors told me he might have 5 years, maybe 10 if we were lucky. They recommended I start making arrangements. Emma's eyes filled with tears she didn't fully understand. That's so sad, Grandma. It was sad, darling. But it was also the beginning of one of the most beautiful chapters of my life, even though I couldn't see it at the time. Margaret's voice grew stronger, more determined. You see, I had a choice to make. I could feel sorry for myself and our situation, or I could love your grandfather with everything I had for whatever time we had left. The memory becomes golden again, but differently now. Not the bright gold of young love, but the deeper, richer gold of autumn. Margaret is helping Thomas get dressed, her movements patient and tender. She's brushing his hair, talking softly to him about their day ahead, and though his responses are sometimes confused, there's still love in his eyes when he looks at her. I chose love, Margaret said simply. Every day, every moment, I chose love. The photographs showed this choice. Margaret reading to Thomas when he could no longer understand the words himself, the three of them in the park, Margaret pushing Michael on a swing while Thomas sat on a bench, watching with a peaceful smile. Christmas morning, Thomas helping Michael open presents with Margaret guiding his hands. Those years, Margaret continued, taught me that love isn't just the easy moments, the joyful times when everything is perfect. Love is staying when staying is hard. Love is finding beauty in broken things. Love is choosing tenderness when your heart is breaking. The scene shows Margaret at night, sitting beside Thomas's bed after she's settled him for sleep, her hand on his chest, listening to him breathe. She looks exhausted, overwhelmed, but there's something unbreakable in her posture, a strength forged in the fire of necessity and refined by devotion. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this adult concept of love that was more complex than anything in her fairy tales. How long did Grandpa Thomas live? Margaret's eyes grew distant. 7 years? 7 years from diagnosis to the day he forgot how to breathe? Michael was 9 when his father died. Old enough to remember him, but young enough that the memories would fade around the edges as he grew up. She turned to a photograph of herself in black, standing beside a small casket with 9-year-old Michael holding her hand, his face solemn beyond his years. And there I was, Margaret said, 32 years old, a widow with a son to raise, and no idea how I was going to survive. The life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses, and Thomas's medical bills had eaten through what little savings we'd managed to accumulate. The camera pans across the empty apartment after the funeral, showing how sparse it had become. Furniture sold to pay for medications, walls bare where paintings had been pawned, the silence heavy with grief and uncertainty. I could have given up then, Margaret said. Part of me wanted to. The easiest thing would have been to move back to Ireland, to let my family take care of us. But something inside me, maybe it was Thomas's spirit, maybe it was just stubborn Irish pride, refused to surrender. Emma leaned forward, invested now in this story of survival. What did you do? I got up every morning and decided to live, Margaret said with a soft smile. It sounds simple when you say it like that, but some mornings, it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I found work as a seamstress in a bridal shop downtown. The hours were long, and the pay was modest. But I could bring Michael with me after school, and he would do his homework in the back room while I worked on wedding dresses for other people's happy beginnings. The flashback shows Margaret at a sewing machine, her fingers flying over delicate white fabric, while young Michael sits at a small table nearby, tongue poking out in concentration as he works on arithmetic problems. The shop is filled with beautiful gowns hanging like ghosts of joy, and afternoon sunlight streams through the front windows. There's something poetic about spending your days creating symbols of hope when your own dreams have been shattered, Margaret mused. Every dress I worked on represented someone's faith in forever, someone's belief that love could conquer all. In a way, those brides gave me hope too, hope that happiness was still possible, even if it looked different than I'd originally imagined. The photographs from this period showed a different Margaret, leaner, more serious, her face marked by responsibility, but still beautiful. Michael appeared in many of them, at school events where Margaret stood alone among couples, at modest birthday parties in their small apartment, on rare outings to the park or the library. Michael was such a good boy during those years, Margaret said, her voice full of maternal pride. He never complained about our circumstances, never asked for things I couldn't provide. He seemed to understand, even at that young age, that we were partners in survival. He would walk himself to school, do his homework without being asked, and help with household chores that should have been my responsibility. A tender scene unfolds. 10-year-old Michael standing on a chair to reach the stove, stirring a pot of soup while Margaret works late at the shop. When she comes home exhausted, she finds the table set, homework completed and neatly stacked, and her son proud of his contribution to their little family dot. Emma smiled at the image of her father as a responsible child. "He still likes to cook," she observed. "Maybe that's where it started." "Perhaps it is," Margaret agreed. "Necessity has a way of teaching us skills we never knew we'd need." Michael learned independence early, but he also learned compassion, responsibility, and resilience. Those were gifts, even if they came wrapped in hardship. She turned several pages, revealing Michael's progression through school. Always serious in his school photos, but with an underlying strength in his posture that spoke of his unusual maturity. There were pictures of him receiving academic awards, participating in school plays, graduating from high school with honors. By the time Michael was ready for college, we had managed to save enough for him to attend Boston University, Margaret said proudly. He wanted to study business, said he was going to make sure we never had to worry about money again. That was my son, always thinking of others, always trying to shoulder responsibility that wasn't his to carry. The scene shows Margaret at Michael's high school graduation, sitting alone in the audience, but beaming with pride as her son receives his diploma. Other families cluster in large groups, but Margaret's solitary presence doesn't diminish her joy. If anything, it amplifies it, as if all her love has been concentrated into this one moment of triumph. College meant he would be living on campus, Margaret continued, and for the first time in 20 years, I would be truly alone. I remember the day we moved him into his dormitory, such a mix of pride and terror in my heart. I was losing my constant companion, my partner in survival, but I was also watching him step into the future we had worked so hard to build. Emma could see the complexity of this moment in her grandmother's expression. Joy and loss intertwined in the way that marked all significant life transitions. "What did you do when he was gone?" "I discovered something wonderful," Margaret said, her eyes lighting up. "I discovered myself. For 20 years, I had been defined by my relationships, first as Thomas's wife, then as Michael's mother. Suddenly, I had the space to remember who Margaret O'Sullivan was when she wasn't taking care of everyone else." The camera follows Margaret through her daily routines in an apartment that feels larger now with Michael gone. She rearranges furniture, hangs new pictures, treats herself to small luxuries she had denied herself for years. There's a lightness in her step, a sense of rediscovery. "I started taking evening classes at the community college," Margaret explained. "Literature, art history, languages, all the subjects I had loved in school but never had time to pursue. I made friends with other students, went to lectures and museum exhibitions, began to build a life that was mine alone." The photographs from this period showed Margaret in her 40s, more confident now, surrounded by classmates at study groups, standing in front of famous paintings at museums, even a few pictures of her with gentleman friends at various social events. "Did you ever think about remarrying?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I had offers," she said with a small smile. There was a lovely widower in my French class, a kind man who owned a bookstore and wrote poetry in his spare time. We went to dinner several times, and he was patient with my hesitations. A gentle scene. Margaret and a distinguished man with salt and pepper hair walking through Boston Common, talking animatedly about literature. He offers his arm when they cross the street, and there's a tenderness between them, but also a certain reserve on Margaret's part. But I realized that my capacity for the kind of total, surrendering love I had shared with Thomas had been used up in those 7 years of caring for him, Margaret continued. What I had left to offer was friendship, companionship, affection, but not the grand passion that some people deserve. It seemed unfair to give someone less than my whole heart, even if that someone would have been grateful for whatever I could offer. Emma pondered this adult complexity of love and relationships, her young mind working to understand the nuances of human emotion. Besides, Margaret added with a twinkle in her eye, by the time I had adjusted to my solitary life, Michael was graduating from college and bringing home a lovely young woman he wanted me to meet. She turned the page to reveal photographs of Michael's college graduation, where he stood between Margaret and a pretty blonde girl with a warm smile and stylish 1980s clothing. Patricia, Margaret said simply, your mother, the daughter I never had, the woman who would make my son complete in ways I never could. The memory becomes cinematic. Michael nervous as he introduces Patricia to Margaret in a nice restaurant, his hands fidgeting with his napkin while the two most important women in his life size each other up. Then Patricia laughs at something Margaret says, and the tension dissolves into warmth. I knew the moment I met her that she would be good for Michael, Margaret continued. She had a lightness about her that balanced his seriousness, a playfulness that brought out the boy in him that had been suppressed by too much early responsibility. And she looked at him the way I had looked at Thomas, as if he were the most remarkable person in the world. The photographs chronicled their courtship, Michael and Patricia at various events, always touching in small ways that spoke of deep affection. Margaret included in many of the pictures, clearly embraced as part of Patricia's chosen family. Their engagement photo, with Patricia wearing a modest but elegant ring and both of them glowing with happiness. The wedding was small but perfect, Margaret remembered, touching a photograph of the ceremony. Patricia wore my wedding dress. We had to alter it significantly, of course, since she was taller than I was, but she insisted she wanted something that connected her to the family history. Michael cried when he saw her walking down the aisle, and I cried because my boy had found the kind of love his father and I had shared. The wedding scene unfolds like a classic film. Patricia, radiant in Margaret's altered dress, walking down the aisle of a small church while Michael waits at the altar, overwhelmed with emotion. Margaret sits in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, surrounded by the small but loving group of family and friends they had assembled. 3 years later, your brother James was born, Margaret continued, turning to photographs of herself holding a wrinkled infant, my first grandchild. I had forgotten how miraculous babies are, how they embody pure possibility, unlimited potential. Holding James, I felt like I was being given a second chance at watching someone grow up, but this time without the weight of total responsibility. Emma smiled, picturing her serious older brother as a tiny baby. Was he a good baby? He was a thoughtful baby. Margaret laughed. Even as an infant, he seemed to be studying everything, trying to figure out how the world worked. He would lie in his crib for hours, just watching the mobile Patricia had hung above him, as if he were solving complex mathematical equations in his infant mind. A tender montage, Margaret feeding James while Patricia recovers from childbirth, Michael holding his son with the same wonder Thomas had shown with baby Michael. 3 generations gathered around the Christmas tree in Margaret's living room, which suddenly feels full of life again. And then came Sarah, Margaret said, her voice becoming more complex, layered with emotions that Emma couldn't quite decipher. 2 years after James, beautiful Sarah with her golden hair and her demanding personality. The photographs showed an adorable toddler with angelic features and what appeared to be a strong will. Even in baby pictures, Sarah seemed to be the center of attention, her parents and grandmother orbiting around her like planets around the sun. Sarah was challenging, Margaret said carefully, choosing her words with the diplomacy of someone who has learned to speak kindly about difficult people. She was extraordinarily beautiful, remarkably intelligent, but also incredibly strong-willed. From the time she could walk, she knew exactly what she wanted and exactly how to get it. A scene of 2-year-old Sarah having a spectacular tantrum in a grocery store, while Margaret, Patricia, and Michael try various strategies to calm her down. Other shoppers stare, some with sympathy, others with judgment, while Sarah continues her protest until she suddenly stops, having apparently achieved whatever goal had motivated the outburst. Patricia used to joke that Sarah would either become a CEO or a dictator. Margaret continued with a rueful smile. She had this ability to manipulate situations to her advantage, even as a small child. And she was so beautiful that people forgave her behaviors that would have been unacceptable in other children. Emma frowned slightly. That doesn't sound very nice. It wasn't always nice, Margaret agreed, but it was part of who Sarah was, and we loved her despite her difficulties. Children aren't born knowing how to consider others' feelings. That's something they have to learn. I kept hoping that as Sarah grew older, she would develop empathy and kindness to match her intelligence and beauty. The photographs showed Sarah's progression through childhood, dance recitals where she clearly loved being on stage, birthday parties where she appeared to be directing other children's activities, school events where she stood out both for her appearance and her apparent confidence. She was talented at everything she tried, Margaret admitted. Dance, music, academics, sports. Sarah excelled at whatever caught her interest. But she also expected to excel, expected to be the center of attention, expected others to accommodate her needs. A scene at one of Sarah's dance recitals, the little girl performing beautifully on stage while her family watches proudly from the audience. But when she comes off stage, instead of being satisfied with the applause, she immediately begins criticizing the other children's performances, unable to simply enjoy her own success. The older she got, the more complicated our relationship became, Margaret said, and Emma could hear years of accumulated hurt in her grandmother's voice. It started with small things, forgetting to say thank you for gifts, ignoring instructions that inconvenienced her, showing favoritism among family members based on what they could do for her. She turned several pages quickly, as if these memories were more painful than the earlier ones of loss and struggle. When Sarah was 8, I made her a beautiful dress for her school's spring concert, Margaret continued. I spent weeks on it, hand-sewing tiny pearls onto the bodice, creating layers of silk that moved like water when she walked. It was perhaps the most beautiful thing I had ever made. The camera shows Margaret working late into the night, her eyes strained from the detailed work, her fingers moving carefully over the delicate fabric. This is clearly a labor of love, every stitch placed with care and devotion. When I presented it to her, do you know what she said? Margaret asked quietly. Emma shook her head, sensing this was a moment of deep pain. She said, "Why couldn't you just buy me something from the store like normal grandmothers?" Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. She wore the dress to the concert, and she looked like a princess. But she never thanked me for it. Not that day. Not ever. The scene shows Sarah in the magnificent dress, clearly the most beautifully dressed child at the concert, but her expression is petulant, as if wearing handmade clothing was somehow beneath her. Margaret watches from the audience, her pride in her creation dimmed by her granddaughter's reaction. That was the beginning of my understanding that Sarah saw people in terms of what they could provide for her, Margaret continued. I was useful when I could sew her special dresses or babysit when her parents needed freedom, but I wasn't valued for who I was as a person. Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand tighter. That's not fair. No, darling, it wasn't fair. But fairness is a luxury that love doesn't always consider, Margaret said, with the wisdom of someone who had learned to accept difficult truths. I kept hoping that maturity would soften Sarah's harder edges, that she would eventually learn to see beyond her own needs and desires. The photographs continued through Sarah's teenage years. Beautiful prom pictures, graduation photos where she was valedictorian, college acceptance letters to prestigious universities. In every image, Sarah appeared perfect, polished, successful. She was accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, Margaret said with complicated pride. Brilliant girl, no question about that. And ambitious, she knew exactly what she wanted from life and how to get it. A scene of the family celebrating Sarah's acceptance to Harvard, everyone toasting her success while she accepts their praise as her due. Margaret raises her glass with the others, but there's something wistful in her expression, as if she's celebrating achievements while mourning the person Sarah might have become. It was during college that Sarah met Richard, Margaret continued, turning to photographs of a handsome young man from an obviously wealthy family. Richard Camden III, heir to a banking fortune, exactly the kind of man Sarah had always said she would marry. Emma studied the photographs. Even she could see that Richard was attractive and well-dressed. But there was something cold about his smile, something calculating about the way he looked at Sarah. Not with love, but with appreciation for a beautiful acquisition. Richard's family had old money, the kind of wealth that comes with social expectations and generational responsibilities, Margaret explained. They lived in a world I'd never imagined. Private jets, multiple homes, charity galas where single events cost more than I had made in entire years as a seamstress. The memory becomes more lavish. Sarah and Richard at elegant parties, surrounded by people in expensive clothing, everything glittering with wealth and privilege. Margaret appears in a few of these scenes, clearly uncomfortable in borrowed evening wear, trying to navigate conversations about subjects she knows nothing about. When Sarah announced their engagement, I was genuinely happy for her, Margaret said. Not because of Richard's money, but because she seemed to have found someone who understood her ambitions, who could provide the kind of life she had always dreamed of living. The engagement photos showed Sarah with a ring that was almost too large for her finger, standing beside Richard in front of what appeared to be a mansion. They looked perfect together, like figures from a magazine about wealthy people's lives. The wedding, Margaret said, her voice becoming carefully controlled, was an event unlike anything I had ever experienced. 250 guests, a country club venue, flowers flown in from Ecuador, a dress that cost more than my car. The wedding scene unfolds like something from a movie about the wealthy elite. An enormous tent decorated with thousands of white roses, guests in designer clothing, a multi-tiered cake that looks like a work of art, Sarah looking absolutely radiant in a gown that could have belonged to royalty. I was so proud, Margaret continued, watching my granddaughter marry into this world of privilege and opportunity. I thought about Thomas, wishing he could have seen how far our family had come. From a poor Irish immigrant couple to grandparents of a Harvard-educated woman marrying into American aristocracy. But Emma could hear something in her grandmother's voice that suggested this fairy tale wedding had not been the joyful celebration it appeared to be. "What went wrong, Grandma?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the wedding photographs. "Nothing went wrong with the wedding itself," she finally said. "It was beautiful, elegant, perfect in every detail. The problem was with my place in it, or rather, my lack of a place in it." She turned to a page that showed the formal family photographs from the wedding day. Emma could see Sarah and Richard in the center, surrounded by what appeared to be Richard's large, well-dressed family. Margaret was in only one photo, standing at the very edge of the group, looking small and out of place in her modest dress. "Sarah had become embarrassed by me," Margaret said quietly. "My background, my accent, my financial circumstances, they didn't fit the image she was trying to project as Richard's wife." A painful flashback. Margaret at the wedding reception, sitting alone at a table in the back, while the celebration continues around her. Sarah glides past in her beautiful dress, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. But she doesn't stop to speak with her grandmother. When Margaret tries to approach, Sarah's conversation with a group of Richard's relatives becomes animated and exclusive, leaving no natural opening for Margaret to join. "I realized that evening that I had become what they call an unwanted guest at my own granddaughter's wedding," Margaret said, her voice heavy with old hurt. "Not unwanted enough to be excluded entirely, that would have been too obvious, but unwanted enough to be ignored, marginalized, treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a family member to be celebrated." Emma felt tears pricking her eyes. "But you're wonderful, Grandma. How could anyone be embarrassed by you?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Oh, my sweet child." In Sarah's world, I represented everything she was trying to leave behind: poverty, struggle, the kind of ordinary life she had worked so hard to escape. I was a reminder that she hadn't been born into privilege, that her elegance was acquired rather than inherited. The scene becomes more pointed. Richard's mother making polite but dismissive conversation with Margaret, clearly marking her as someone from a different social class. Margaret handles the interaction with dignity, but the message is clear. She doesn't belong in this world, and everyone knows it. After the wedding, the distance between us became even more pronounced. Margaret continued. Sarah moved into Richard's family compound in Greenwich, Connecticut. She sent thank you notes for wedding gifts, written on engraved stationery, but they felt formal, impersonal, the kind of notes you might send to distant acquaintances. The photographs from this period showed Sarah in her new life: charity events, society parties, elegant dinners. She looked sophisticated and confident, perfectly at home in her wealthy surroundings. But Margaret appeared in none of these pictures. When Sarah became pregnant with their first child, I was hopeful that becoming a mother might awaken her capacity for deeper love, Margaret said. I imagined myself as a doting great-grandmother, passing on family stories and traditions, teaching this new baby about our Irish heritage. A tender scene of Margaret knitting baby clothes, her face bright with anticipation as she creates tiny sweaters and blankets with the same care she had once put into Sarah's dance costumes. She imagines holding her great-grandchild, singing the same lullabies Thomas had sung to Michael. But when little Alexander was born, I learned that my role in his life would be carefully limited, Margaret said. Sarah hired a professional nanny, enrolled in Mommy and Me classes with other wealthy mothers, created a social circle that had no place for a working-class Irish grandmother with an accent and calloused hands. Emma could see the pain this caused her grandmother, how each exclusion must have felt like a small death. I saw Alexander perhaps 6 times in his first year, Margaret continued. Always brief visits, always with Sarah controlling every interaction, always with the subtle message that I was a guest in their lives rather than family. A heartbreaking scene, Margaret holding baby Alexander while Sarah hovers nearby, clearly anxious about germs, inappropriate influences, or simply the optics of her grandmother's less than elegant presence in her perfect nursery. The same pattern repeated when Caroline was born 2 years later, Margaret said. Beautiful children, growing up in a world of privilege and opportunity, but growing up as strangers to me. She turned the page to reveal more recent photographs, holiday cards showing Richard, Sarah, and their 2 children in perfectly coordinated outfits, posed in front of Christmas trees that looked professionally decorated. They send cards, Margaret said simply. Beautiful cards with professional photographs and printed messages wishing me health and happiness. But no personal notes, no invitations to visit, no requests for my presence in their lives. Emma studied.
A scene unfolds of a rare family gathering. James, Patricia, young Emma, and her infant brother at Margaret's house for Thanksgiving. Sarah arrives late with Richard and the children, making polite conversation but clearly uncomfortable in the modest surroundings. She checks her phone frequently and mentions several times that they can't stay long because of other commitments. Besides, Margaret continued, I didn't want to burden your father with complaints about his niece. He had his own challenges building his business, providing for your mother and you children. The last thing he needed was an elderly mother creating family drama over hurt feelings. Emma frowned. But they weren't just hurt feelings, were they? They were treating you badly. You're wise for your age, sweetheart, Margaret said with a sad smile. But sometimes adults convince themselves that keeping peace is more important than addressing problems. I told myself that Sarah's behavior was just temporary, that she would eventually mature into kindness. I told myself that having a small role in my great-grandchildren's lives was better than having no role at all. She turned several more pages, showing the progression of years marked primarily by those formal holiday cards and the occasional newspaper clipping about Richard's business successes or Sarah's charity work, and then came the invitation, Margaret said, reaching for the cream-colored envelope that had started this entire conversation. Alexander's wedding invitation. Arriving 3 days ago, Emma looked at the elegant calligraphy, the expensive paper, the formal language that somehow managed to be both inclusive and exclusionary. It's beautiful, she said uncertainly. It is beautiful, Margaret agreed. And it represents something I should be celebrating, my great-grandson getting married, starting his own family, continuing the legacy that began with Thomas and me all those decades ago. The camera focuses on the invitation, particularly the line that reads, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Camden III request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son Alexander Thomas Camden to Miss Victoria Elizabeth Hartwell. The middle name Thomas stands out, a connection to the great-grandfather Alexander never knew. Alexander chose to include Thomas's name, Margaret said, noticing where Emma's eyes had landed. I don't know if that was his idea or just a coincidence, but seeing it there, it reminded me of everything we've lost, everything that's been forgotten. Emma could sense there was more to the story, something that had transformed her grandmother's sadness into something harder, more resolved. What happened when you got the invitation, Grandma? Margaret took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for the most difficult part of her story. I called Sarah, she said simply. For the first time in 2 years, I picked up the phone and called my granddaughter to congratulate her on her son's engagement and to ask about the wedding details. The scene shows Margaret in her kitchen, holding her old rotary phone with hands that shake slightly from nervousness. She has practiced what she will say, rehearsed how to sound appropriately pleased without being overwhelming. Sarah seemed surprised to hear from me, Margaret continued. Not pleased exactly, but surprised. She thanked me for calling, told me a few basic details about the wedding. It would be at their country club. About 150 guests, very elegant affair. Emma could hear in her grandmother's tone that this conversation had not gone well. I asked about accommodations, Margaret said. The wedding is in Greenwich, 2 hours from here, and I don't drive distances like that anymore. I thought perhaps I could stay at a nearby hotel. Or maybe there would be transportation arranged for elderly guests. The scene becomes uncomfortable. Sarah on the other end of the phone line, clearly not having considered her grandmother's practical needs, fumbling for a response that sounds considerate while actually being dismissive. Sarah said she would look into it. Margaret continued, but her tone suggested this was an inconvenience she hadn't anticipated. Then she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the reception would be quite formal and that she hoped I would be comfortable with the social expectations. Emma's young face showed confusion at these adult subtleties, but she could sense the cruelty hidden in polite language. What did she mean by that? She meant, Margaret said with painful clarity, that I should consider whether I really belonged at such an elegant event. She was giving me permission to exclude myself, to save everyone the embarrassment of having a working-class Irish grandmother at their sophisticated celebration. The cruelty of this suggestion hung in the air between them. Emma, with the moral clarity of childhood, looked genuinely shocked. That's terrible, Grandma. You are Alexander's great-grandmother. Of course you belong at his wedding. That's what I thought too, Margaret said, and something in her voice had changed, become stronger, more determined. So I told Sarah that I would be delighted to attend, that I would arrange my own transportation and accommodations, and that I was looking forward to meeting Victoria's family and celebrating this joyful occasion. The scene shows Margaret's face during this phone call, and there's a transformation happening, the hurt grandmother becoming someone with more steel in her spine, someone who has decided she will not be dismissed so easily. Sarah's silence lasted so long I thought we had been disconnected, Margaret continued. Finally, she said, of course, grandmother. We're looking forward to having you there, but her voice was cold, formal, the tone you might use with someone you were obligated to invite but hoped wouldn't come. Emma was leaning forward now, invested in the story of family conflict that was more complex than any fairy tale. But you're going to go, right? Oh yes, Margaret said, and now there was something almost fierce in her expression. I'm going to go. In fact, I've already made some very interesting preparations. She stood up from her chair, moving with more energy than she had shown all afternoon, and walked to an old wardrobe in the corner of the room. From it, she retrieved a garment bag that looked expensive and new. Come here, sweetheart, she said to Emma. I want to show you something. Emma approached as Margaret unzipped the bag, revealing a dress that made the child gasp with surprise. It was stunning, a deep navy blue silk with subtle beading that caught the light, elegant and sophisticated without being ostentatious. The cut was classic, timeless, the kind of dress that belonged in the most exclusive social circles. Grandma, Emma breathed, it's beautiful. Where did you get it? Margaret smiled, and for the first time all afternoon, it was a smile without any sadness in it. I made it, she said simply. These old hands haven't forgotten how to create beautiful things. I've spent the past 2 months designing and sewing this dress, using techniques I learned decades ago when I worked on bridal gowns. The camera reveals Margaret working late into the night, just as she had done for Sarah's childhood dress. But this time she's working for herself. Her movements are sure, practiced, the work of someone who has spent a lifetime creating beauty from fabric and thread. But that's not all, Margaret continued, walking to her dressing table and opening a small jewelry box. Inside lay a stunning set of sapphire and diamond jewelry, earrings, a necklace, and a bracelet that looked like they belonged in a museum. Emma's eyes widened. Are those real? Very real, Margaret confirmed. They belonged to Thomas's grandmother, brought over from Ireland when the family emigrated. I've kept them in this box for 60 years. Never having an occasion special enough to wear them. A flashback reveals a much younger Margaret receiving the jewelry from Thomas's dying mother, who presses them into her hands with a whisper, for when you need to remember that you come from people of worth, no matter what the world tells you. I spent last week having them cleaned and appraised, Margaret continued. The jeweler told me they're worth more than Richard's car. Apparently, Thomas's family had more valuable possessions than anyone realized. They just never had reason to display their wealth. Emma was beginning to understand that her grandmother was planning something more than just attending a wedding. There's more, Margaret said, walking to her desk and retrieving a thick manila folder. I've spent the past month doing some research about Richard's family, their business dealings, their social circle. She opened the folder to reveal newspaper clippings, business documents, and what appeared to be investigative notes written in Margaret's careful handwriting. Did you know that Richard's great-grandfather made his fortune selling supplies to both sides during the Civil War? Margaret asked conversationally. Or that his father was investigated for tax evasion in the 1980s but avoided prosecution through political connections? Emma shook her head, fascinated by this transformation of her gentle grandmother into someone who seemed capable of sophisticated planning. And Sarah's charity work, Margaret continued. The foundation she chairs that supposedly helps underprivileged children. I discovered that less than 20% of the donations actually reach children in need. The rest goes to administrative costs and social events for wealthy donors. The scene shows Margaret at the library, using computers with the patient determination of someone learning new skills, taking careful notes, building a file of information about the family that had tried to exclude her. Grandma, Emma said slowly, what are you planning to do with all this? Margaret's smile was mysterious, almost mischievous. I'm planning to attend my great-grandson's wedding, darling. I'm planning to look absolutely magnificent, to be gracious and charming, and to remind everyone present exactly who I am and where this family came from. She sat back down in her chair, but her posture was different now, straighter, more confident. You see, Emma, I realized something important while I was making my dress and researching the Camden family history. I've spent 20 years allowing Sarah to make me feel ashamed of who I am, a woman who survived poverty, widowhood, and single motherhood to raise a good son and contribute to her community. I've let her treat me like an embarrassment when I should be treated like a matriarch. The camera captures Margaret in this moment of resolution, and she looks transformed not just in her posture, but in her entire presence. The uncertain grandmother has become someone with a clear sense of her own worth. At Alexander's wedding, I'm going to be exactly who I am, Margaret continued. I'm going to wear clothes that announce my presence, jewelry that speaks of family history, and I'm going to tell stories about the sacrifices that made their privilege possible. Emma clapped her hands together. You're going to show them. I'm going to show them, Margaret agreed, but not in anger, sweetheart. In dignity. I'm going to remind them that families are built on foundations of love and sacrifice, not just money and social position. I'm going to make sure Alexander knows about his great-grandfather Thomas, about the grandmother who sewed late into the night to provide for her family, about the heritage he carries whether his mother acknowledges it or not. A scene unfolds of Margaret's imagination, herself at the wedding reception, elegant and confident, holding court with a group of guests as she tells stories about Irish emigration, about the courage it took to start over in a new country, about the kinds of values that create lasting family bonds. And if Sarah is embarrassed by my presence, Margaret continued with quiet determination, then she'll have to be embarrassed by someone who looks and sounds like she belongs in their world. She'll have to explain to her friends why she's been hiding such an interesting, accomplished family member. Emma giggled. She won't know what to do. No, Margaret agreed. She won't, because I've spent 20 years playing by her rules, accepting her definition of who I should be and how much space I should take up in this family. But I'm 78 years old, Emma. I don't have time left to waste on making other people comfortable at the expense of my own dignity. She reached over and took Emma's hands in hers, her touch warm and strong. This is what I want you to remember from my story, sweetheart. Life will try to teach you that you should make yourself smaller to accommodate other people's discomfort. People will suggest that you should hide parts of yourself that don't match their expectations. But your worth isn't determined by other people's approval, it's determined by how fully you live as yourself. The camera pulls back to show grandmother and granddaughter in the golden evening light. Two generations connected by love and understanding. The older woman passing on hard-won wisdom to the younger. Your great-grandfather Thomas used to say that the only sin worse than cruelty is cowardice, Margaret continued. For 20 years, I've been a coward about standing up to Sarah's treatment. I've told myself I was keeping peace, but really I was just afraid of conflict. Afraid of losing what little connection I had with my great-grandchildren. Afraid of not being good enough for their world, Emma nodded solemnly. But you're not afraid anymore. No, Margaret said firmly. I'm not afraid anymore. I've survived too much to be intimidated by someone's country club manners and social pretensions. I've loved too deeply and lost too much to waste whatever time I have left worrying about whether I embarrass people who should be proud to claim me. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the room, but instead of the melancholy that had marked the beginning of their conversation, there was energy in the air, the excitement of someone who has made an important decision. Will you tell me about the wedding afterward? Emma asked. Will you tell me what happens when you walk in wearing your beautiful dress and jewelry? Oh, my dear child, Margaret laughed. I'll tell you everything. And I suspect it will be quite a story. The final scene shows them together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the photographs and memories that have shaped Margaret's life, but looking forward now rather than back. The old woman who began this conversation in sadness has become someone with a mission. Someone ready to reclaim her rightful place in her family's story. But for now, Margaret said, standing and beginning to collect the photographs, let's have some dinner. All this storytelling has made me hungry, and I need to keep up my strength for the performance of a lifetime. As they moved toward the kitchen together, Emma carrying some of the photo albums, she looked up at her grandmother with new respect and understanding. Grandma Maggie? Yes, sweetheart. I think Sarah is going to be very surprised, Margaret smiled. And in that smile was the echo of every strong woman who had ever refused to be diminished. Every grandmother who had ever fought for her place in her family's story. Every person who had ever chosen dignity over acceptance. Oh yes, she said softly. I believe she will be. Epilogue. 3 weeks later, the camera opens on the same cozy living room. But now it's filled with flowers, congratulatory bouquets from friends and neighbors. Margaret sits in her chair again, but she's different now. Glowing with the satisfaction of someone who has accomplished exactly what she set out to do, Emma bursts through the front door. Still in her school clothes, her face bright with excitement. Grandma, tell me everything. Mom said you were absolutely magnificent. Margaret laughs, a sound full of joy and vindication. Well, my dear, it was quite an evening. Quite an evening indeed. She reaches for a new photo album, this one filled with pictures from Alexander's wedding, including several stunning photographs of Margaret herself, regal in her navy dress and antique jewelry, surrounded by admirers at the reception. You know, Margaret says, opening to a picture of herself dancing with Alexander, both of them laughing. I think your great-great-grandfather Thomas would have been very proud. And in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by evidence of a life fully lived and dignity finally reclaimed, Margaret O'Sullivan begins to tell the story of the most satisfying evening of her 78 years, the night she reminded her family and herself exactly who she was and always had been. The camera slowly pulls back from the window of the small house, showing grandmother and granddaughter bent over the photo album together. The next chapter of their family's story unfolding in whispered conversations and shared laughter, proving that sometimes the most important victories are the ones we claim for ourselves, in our own time, in our own way.